Welcome back to EDIT 640. It's Joe again, here to present this week's module on storyboarding and scriptwriting. In this lesson, we'll learn that these two terms don't necessarily mean the same thing in every production project. In fact, they can be developed in a variety of different formats. The module will focus on 4 critically important steps in the planning process, including how to visualize a project before you ever even pick up the camera, how to write a treatment so that others will understand what your vision is, how to develop a storyboard so that you can get the shots that you think you need, and of course, how to create a production script. But first, let's go ahead and begin with a quick review of the workflow model that we previously learned about instructional video production. We should all understand by now that the analysis phase involves identifying the target audience, defining what the specific learning outcomes will be for the production, selecting the appropriate structures, identifying the media that you're going to need to tell your story, determining what output file formats are appropriate, drafting a schedule, a production schedule, so you know when to be, where to shoot, who, and of course, how to accommodate constraints. In the next phase of the instructional video production workflow, the emphasis is on design. And there are 4 important steps. As we mentioned earlier, most of the projects in instructional video production begin with some type of visualization exercise. And we follow that up typically with writing a treatment. After that, we also include how to design a storyboard and then how to develop a script. And the next few slides here are going to break each one of these down into much more detail. The first step in the visualization process ultimately is choosing a style. And this is different from the analysis phase because in the analysis phase, you're contemplating, you're brainstorming, you're planning, you're thinking, reflecting, trying to make up these decisions, but ultimately in the design phase, you have to have made that choice. You have to make the commitment, and part of that commitment involves picking a style. And style is one of those subjective terms, of course, but in our context, it has a significant meaning of the level of formality on the continuum between the entertainment value that the production provides and the instructional value, the amount of learning that takes place within the actual production. And obviously this is determined largely by context, especially the type of content you're teaching and of course the target audience. For example, how you would teach the concept of July 4th in an instructional video to elementary students would be very different from what you might teach high school students in a social studies class. The second step in the visualization process is to scout. You need to scout the locations where you think you might plan to shoot. And the reason this is important to do in the visualization process is because this scouting activity is actually a great source of inspiration. When you're on site, you can see what kind of light you're dealing with. You can see what kind of backgrounds you're dealing with. And remember, site scouting could be inside or outside, and not necessarily meaning that these are all external shoots. And that in turn stimulates your thinking about the type of shot composition and framing that you want to use, the type of props and costumes, the types of individual shots that you want to use, the kind of motion that you want to have. You're starting to think about the continuity between some of the shots. So it's very, very important during the visualization process to go to the potential locations and observe, think, check them at different times if they're outside so you can see what the lighting is doing. We'll talk a lot more about that later on in the course. And treat this as an activity to help stimulate your thinking about other decisions that you'll have to make. Third step, of course, we have to choose those structures. Remember the frameworks and structures that we looked at previously? Well, during the design phase, you have to make that commitment. Are you going to have an on-screen host? Will you have this on-screen host serve as a source of narration, or will that host simply provide the transitions between different segments while another omniscient narrator speaks? These are decisions that you have to make. Will the subjects that you interview be articulate enough, realistically, to use their dialogue as voiceovers for various cutaway segments? Do you need demonstration sequences? Are you going to need actors to help you reenact scenes that would otherwise be difficult or impossible to film? And even though animation is to a large extent beyond the budgetary means of most teacher producers, there are some free animation tools certainly that could be helpful, such as Google Earth, for example. We see lots of Earth zoom shots embedded in instructional videos to help situate the audience so they understand what the location is for the shoot. Anyway, the point is, these are the typical structures that we tend to see in instructional video productions, and now is the time in the design phase to make that commitment. These are the structures that I primarily want to focus on in this project. Of course, as soon as you do that, you need to start thinking about how you're going to sequence them. Simply knowing that you need a host who's going to serve as the narrator as well, and a few interview segments interwoven between there, simply knowing that doesn't help you much, because you have to put these in order. And so you have to think far in advance about how you want to structure this, even if after you've made those choices. So give some serious thought to deciding how your story will be told within the context of the limited handful of frameworks or structures that you're using. The next step, of course, is to actually start writing. And it's important that you understand what treatments are. This is probably a term that you have never heard of before, but they're very common in the industry, and it's simply a summary, a written summary of the production. Quite literally, it's what the audience will see and hear in order, in sequence, as it plays back across the screen. And here's an example, and this is taken from a Samantha Brown episode, Everybody's Jealous of Her Job, we know, on the Travel Channel. But here's an example of just a small portion of what a treatment might be. And the full treatment for a 30-minute episode could be quite long, but this is only for the first couple minutes of one of her episodes, which we'll look at here in just a second. But it reads, after an opening narrated montage previewing the episode on Martha's Vineyard, Samantha Brown explains its location, size, and history, then walks through Oak Bluffs, one of its quirky towns, interacting with residents on a porch and inviting herself in for a tour. The audio alternates between dialogue with the residents and the narration. The camera follows her to her next stop at an ice cream shop, serving cones that are mixed with lobster. Now, regardless of what you think about an ice cream cone with lobster mixed in it, this is an example of a treatment that summarizes everything a viewer would see. And one of the simplest ways to describe what a treatment is to think how you would explain a show you just watched to someone who didn't see it. So let's take a look at an example here. Let's play just a couple minutes of this clip.
This weekend, I'm in Nantucket. Wow! Tasting native foods. Someone order a clam bake. And sampling a colorful lifestyle.
So right now you just want me to kind of go nuts.
But I'm also in Martha's Vineyard, getting to know the locals.
Woohoo! I'm cow fed!
And debunking tall tales.
Isn't this where they shot a scene in Jaws?
These two islands seem similar at first glance, but between them lies a fierce rivalry.
We all have our teeth here, and
Them's fighting words!
From eccentric architecture
seem to have wandered onto the pages of a well-illustrated children's book.
to a maritime fantasy.
This is the working class neighborhood.
working class, of course.
This weekend, I visit both islands and decide which is king.
Martha's Vineyard!
Okay, let me turn that down here while they do the opening credits here. I hope you noticed that that was a very detailed montage sequence where you had lots and lots of clips mixed in with narration. And that's a very common formula that they use. All right, let's turn it back up.
Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket are two beautiful islands off the coast of Cape Cod. Both islands were once inhabited by Native Americans before the English took them over in the 17th century. And now they're beloved by New England vacationers for their miles of beaches and lush rolling hills.
All right, so I'm making my first approach into Martha's Vineyard. Look at this harbor. It looks charming. I think I'm going to like it here. All the people in Nantucket are like, oh.
Martha's Vineyard is a much larger island than Nantucket. 125 miles of shoreline versus Nantucket's 82. It has 6 towns, each with their own personalities. The ferry drops me off at Oak Bluffs, where I come across the Methodist Campground, now a unique residential neighborhood that encapsulates how individual the vineyard can be.
I seem to have wandered onto the pages of a well-illustrated children's book. There's where Mother...
Did you notice that shot? That was a pretty amazing shot there. Let me back up just a hair here. I want you to watch that shot of her in front of the house. Watch the switch in the angle of the lens here. The camera stays in the same place, but it also opens up the angle on its lens, giving the illusion that the house changes size while she remains almost constant. Very, very cool shot.
I seem to have wandered onto the pages of a well-illustrated children's book. There's
See
where
that?
Mother
Very
Goose
subtle.
lives. Tweedledum and Tweedledee live there. I wonder if Humpty Dumpty's home. It's like they're little doll houses, aren't they?
Okay, I'm going to turn this down here while she continues to talk. What I want to point out here is the rhythm that this type of production sets up. She has a lot of dialogue that's captured both in the field, her field audio, as well as narration that she records afterward. And the audio track bounces back and forth between her pre-recorded narration and the field audio, such as this scene here where we're having a dialogue between these people. Even though it's not an interview, that is the structure that we would identify that. And from here, of course, she goes on her little tour through the house here, and the camera follows her around. A nice 3-shot there with these cutaways to the actual house, where she obviously describes whatever's relevant about this particular house. And I'm sorry, I don't seem to be paying attention. I'm looking more at the production quality attributes of it. But notice the rhythm again. Cut away to the house, and then go back to a 2-shot or a 3-shot of these guests, or I guess they're not guests. She's the guest of these residents, these owners that are talking about the place they live in. Notice how much the camera moves around when we have the cutaway shots. Okay, 1-shot to 2-shot there, and then we'll cut away here to some more house footage.
Live on Nantucket. Beautiful island. It's a beautiful island. But they talk about exclusivity or whatever. I can remember when they would, I guess back in the 60s, in the so-called hippie generation, they would meet them at
Okay, this story is getting a little boring. Let me skip ahead here and go to the next sequence. I want you to see one more shot here. She's going for some ice cream.
Which one are you looking at? I think I'm going to try the famous lobster ice cream.
Is there a real lobster in this ice cream? Is it really? So I'm really.
That's our #1 question.
Wow. And do people try just as a kind of a dare, or do they come back for more lobster ice cream?
The most popular way that we serve it is as a sample. But some people come, and I had this one man who would come and he'd take a quart home every time they left.
So is it real chunks of lobster?
Real chunks of lobster.
It's not like shredded. It's not like lobster flavor. And what if you want drawn butter?
Well, the base of the ice cream is butter, so we've dipped it for you. You don't have to go anywhere.
Wow. Speaking of Martha's Vineyard,
All right.
lobster ice cream.
Okay, let's take a look at this particular shot right here. This is called a reaction shot, and I call your attention to it because it's a very, very useful cutaway. If you've got a principal subject, in this case Samantha Brown, doing something on camera, and you want to convey a sense of anticipation, one of the most common ways to do that is while she's doing whatever the action is, in this case eating an ice cream cone, you cut away to someone else who's in that scene with her, and hopefully they have an inquisitive or some type of emotional reaction on their face. And this then is a very convenient way to convey that emotion toward the audience. So anyway, we could go on here. I'll cut her off right now. But the larger point, of course, here is that treatments are written summaries of everything that happens on screen. So let's leave Samantha Brown. Let's look at another example here. In this example here, Tom Brokaw is both narrator and on-screen host. And the summary treatment reads like this. Tom Brokaw narrates a gloomy opening montage about the devastating potential long-term impact of global warming as a preview for the show. He then talks directly to the camera to invite the viewer to learn about the scientific evidence presented in the show. The next segment cuts away to narrated coverage about a specific location, the Patagonian ice field, where a glacier scientist explains the aggressive melting phenomenon. Brokaw then narrates a before and after sequence of comparison photos and then interviews another scientist who offers testimony to the severity of glacial melting, and on and on. So the treatment provides enough information so that anyone who didn't see the video knows exactly what happened as it happened on screen. But let's see this. We'll watch just a little bit of this. A couple things I want to show you as well. A couple things I want you to pay attention to. We'll talk about in just a second here. Pay attention to the rhythm of the narration and interview. Those two structures are cut back and forth constantly. And you'll see that Brokaw uses his studio narration after the fact to cover most of his transitions.
This may be the future of our planet. The skyscrapers of downtown New York City stand in 80 feet of water. Its famous subway system submerged.
Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, Miami, they would all be underwater.
Okay, so what you're seeing here, of course, is a montage sequence, and we've got lots of narration cutting back and forth between these various shots, and mixed in we have some interview dialogue as well. And it's kind of like the old drunk driving videos that you saw when you were a kid, where they give you the really scary scenario and try to scare you into submission. And this is not to undermine the content here, but it's just a technique to grab the viewer's attention. So it continues here. It's a rather elaborate introductory sequence here, and eventually, I'm going to skip ahead here just a little bit. Right here. Okay, this is the Patagonia sequence. Let's watch this for a minute.
Of ice outside of Antarctica and Greenland, covering almost 7,000 square miles and extending all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
When I was here in 1998, this lake was completely full of icebergs. We couldn't even get our boat to the ice front, and you can see most of the icebergs now have melted.
Glaciologist Stefan Harrison and his colleagues have studied the ice fields for almost 2 decades. Here.
Now, I'm not sure how you folks feel about this, but if you listen carefully, I'm going to make the argument that the audio track here is just a little bit too loud compared to the narration for that particular segment. Regardless, you can see here how we've got a lot of narration and we have all of this cutaway footage, and then interwoven in between here, of course, we have the interview segments.
The reason why we think climate change is so significant now, though, it's happening at a historically fast rate.
Rapid melting is not happening just to the glaciers of Patagonia.
So, again, interview segment, narration, interview segment, narration. This is what helps establish the rhythm here in this particular piece. Now he comes back on screen to talk directly to the viewer.
Yet they're melting so rapidly, they could vanish in my lifetime. Once there were more than 150 glaciers here. Today, there are fewer than 40. As these before,
okay, here's the comparison sequence we talked about.
Glaciers that took thousands of years to form are disintegrating in only decades. And it's happening from the Andes to Alaska.
I've heard a lot of people say, hey, global warming, bring it on. I live up here in northern Montana. I'll be able to swim in this lake in April.
If all it meant was slightly mild.
Okay, so here we have our sit-down interview segment where Tom is not only on camera here as host, he's a host interviewing a principal scientist here. And notice the back and forth there between the cams. We had a wide shot cutting to an over-the-shoulder right-hand, over Tom's right-hand shoulder, close-up shot of the scientist. Anyway, so the video goes on with this same rhythm. Here's our animation, of course, probably beyond most of our budgets. But the point, again, is the rhythm between narration and interview, and then how the narration is used as transition, to help transition between the different segments. Let's look at one last example here This is for the science show, of course. Bill Nye the Science Guy. We all recognize Bill. Does a very good job. Is very popular with academic productions. And in this particular episode on ocean currents, the treatment would read something like this. Bill Nye the Science Guy challenges the viewer to decide which of two displayed containers of water will taste saltier if mixed with the exact same amount of salt. The one with more water or the one with less. After pouring in the salt and mixing, he explains that one result is heavier water. He then pours the salt concentration into an aquarium of clear water to demonstrate this difference, and the dyed salty water sinks to the bottom. He then explains how this difference in mass relates to ocean currents, and the show continues. So let's take a look at this, and I want you to notice a couple things. You'll probably see right away that this was shot in a 4:3 aspect ratio. So shame on Bill Nye. This is actually a recent shot, and they're still producing in 4:3, which is unusual. You'll also note that this particular production is all done in a studio, so no field audio or field video that's introduced here. There are a lot of cameras, however, a lot of camera positions, so it's definitely a multicam production. And you'll see many different post-production effects, such as fast forward, there's some audio effects, and goofy music. And obviously, they're there to engage the target audience, which is for younger learners. So let's watch the beginning of this sequence here, and then through the demonstration.
Bill Nye the Science Guy. Bill Nye the Science Guy. Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Here we have some colored water, and here's some salt. Now suppose we dissolve these equal amounts of salt in this water. Which one is going to taste saltier?
I don't know.
Well, let's try it. Well, that's easy. This one's going to taste saltier because it has the same amount of salt dissolved in less water. Now let's say we were out in the middle of the ocean and the sun is beating down. What's going to happen? Well, some of the seawater is going to evaporate into the air and the salt is going to stay there. It's just like having the same amount of salt dissolved in less water. Now the more salt in the water, the heavier it is. So it sinks.
Okay, so the production continues through there, and you can see the rhythm, what we're dealing with here. You have several cameras in the room. This is your main shot here, and this wide shot here of the entire desk with him behind it. And you'll notice that he seems to be centered a lot, and that's more a reflection of the 4:3 aspect ratio really than anything else. And obviously the special effects, like we talked about, were designed to capture the attention of a younger audience. You had the silly effect there with his eyebrows, of course the sped up mixing sequence there, and all of this is just done just to keep the kids' attention. Okay, good enough. So anyway, so we didn't have to watch the whole clip there, but I think again the larger point here is that writing a treatment explains everything that you see on screen. So let's move on. Okay, let's talk about storyboards. In the design process, the storyboard is a visualization exercise for every shot and every shot type, with the exception of maybe montage, because montage is you know what a montage is. It's a collection of very fast-moving clips. You can't always storyboard, nor is it really productive or efficient to storyboard every single clip in a montage. You might be better off just saying insert montage here and then edit that in the timeline when you're ready to. Regardless, the storyboarding is an absolutely essential visualization process because it forces you to put everything in sequence in the timeline. It's what the viewer actually sees from start to finish. It also serves as a great way to guide the camera operator, so the camera operator knows exactly how to frame the shot, what angle you want, and if there's any motion that you need in the actual shot. It also is very important to help you generate shot lists so that you can then use that as a reference when you're setting up your shooting schedules. Typically, and we'll talk a lot more about this later, but it obviously will make sense to you that you want to shoot by location. And locations may not necessarily be in the actual order of the storytelling production. You might just shoot by location simply because of their convenience. Anyway, we'll talk more about that later. So designing a storyboard is really a three-step process. First, of course, you need to get your shot list. Second, you have to sequence those shots and put them in order. And third, of course, you need to sketch the shots for composition. And this is really why it's called a board, a storyboard, because you're actually drawing. And certainly no one expects out of an instructional production a high-quality LucasArts professionally drawn comic book sketch. Some of you may draw better than others. I certainly swim at the shallow end of that gene pool, and you'll see nothing but stick figures from me, and you'll like it. And I suspect that there are many others that are limited in that ability as well. But what these sketches do is they allow you to tell a story, or to sketch out the story, so that the various people involved, especially the camera operator, even if it's you, so that they know exactly what kind of shot that they need to capture. This also helps plan for continuity and to avoid problems. Let's take a look at an example here. In this particular example, this is a storyboard for a production teaching students and faculty how to deal with an active shooter. Sorry if this is so morbid sounding and perhaps very timely given what's happened over the past few years at campuses, but this is an actual storyboard for a training production on how to react when you get a message that is sent to a faculty member to a podium where they have these special devices installed in particular classrooms. What do you do next? Well, anyway, you can see as it progresses from left to right and top to bottom, you have different shots. And then underneath those shots, I know you can't read it here, but it's not terribly important. Underneath those shots, you have a description of what's happening, what kind of shot it is, what the camera's doing, and a summary of the audio. Not the actual audio, but a summary of the audio. All of this is really, really important to sketch out in advance because it helps you plan for continuity, to plan for those match cuts, to plan for the appropriate angles, the appropriate types of shots that are going to help contribute to the overall narrative, because you don't want to end up with surprises in the editing timeline when you realize, oh my gosh, it's too late to go back and reshoot this stuff. How am I going to stitch it together? So the storyboard is critical to avoid a lot of lengthy hacks that you have to do later on to try to cover something that you forgot, a mistake that you made previously. Following the storyboard, some productions also involve writing an actual script. And that's going to depend. It's very context-based, and there are lots of different script options. What you see here is commonly referred to as an AV script. You have a column for video and a column for audio. You also have an AV storyboard, which is a variation of this, and I'll show that to you in the next slide here. That's actually what I'm going to recommend. But in the AV script, you tend to have a sketched out shot frame in each left-hand column, in each cell as you go down the list. And then on the right-hand side, you have the corresponding audio. If it's narration to be recorded, you have the exact audio script written down there. It's not a summary. It's the exact words that the narrator would say. If it's interview dialogue or improvised dialogue, sometimes you'll see people just write a summary of that in the audio column. But anything that needs to be narrated is written out completely. And this is done for a very simple reason. You're trying to synchronize how these clips are going to relate to their corresponding audio. So it's really, really important to know that if you have a particular word in your audio track and the shot needs to cut over to a different shot right on that word, you need to know when that word occurs in the actual production. And so that's why for narration, it's always written out. What I'm going to recommend that you folks do for your productions is to create what's called, it's a kind of a hybrid of both. It's called an AV storyboard, where you have both a frame to draw your your stick figures. That would be right here. That's where that goes. You then have some fields over here on the right-hand side where you can put some information that will help you keep track of this shot. And then over here on the bottom, of course, you explain what kind of shot it is. It's a wide shot, zoom from left to right, and then down below you would have any corresponding narration written out completely, or dialogue. And if it's short dialogue, you can write that out completely if you want. Or if it's improvisational dialogue that was captured during an interview, you can simply say something like interview with subject about volcanoes, or whatever the topic is. But this is an AV storyboard, and it combines, I think, the best of the AV script and the storyboard, and it will be a very important tool for you to use as you plan your productions. Later on in our course, obviously, you have to submit your AV storyboard. There is a document available, a template available in our course management system, so you can go ahead and grab that at any time. Feel free to make copies of it or adjust it. It's just a word processing document, and you can make changes to it as necessary. But make sure you put all of your scripted audio down, and make sure you draw those stick figures exactly as they need to be framed. Don't forget your rule of thirds. Well, that concludes Module 5 on storyboarding and script writing. Remember, the key takeaway is that great instructional video production requires careful and systematic planning, so please keep these steps in mind as you begin to design your final course projects. And as always, don't forget to check the main course site for information about the homework assignment. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.